All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar on file sharing best practices, tips, and tricks. My name is Joe Costa, I'm a solutions architect at Qumulo. I'm joined today by Phil Pereira, who's a customer success engineer. We also have Mandy and Billy, which pretty sure most of you guys have met from a customer success team. So let's get started. So today, we're going to be covering quite a few topics. Hopefully we'll have time enough to get through everything in the hour that we have scheduled, but I will be hanging around for some time after the hour is done if there's any questions that we can help answer. So today we're going to be covering some topics on access management and role-based access controls. We're going to talk about some common best practices regardless of the filing protocol that you're using. Then we'll have a session specifically on SMB Shares, another one on NFS Exports. Then we'll have a session at the end about troubleshooting some common access issues. So let's talk a little bit about access management. One thing that's important to always keep in mind is that Qumulo uses a single unified QACL format to store all the file permissions on an object. So regardless of the protocol that is being used, these permissions are enforced equally. It doesn't matter if you come in over FTP, S3, NFS, SMB, permissions is evaluated based on the single unified QACL format. Now, you can take a look at the raw QACL yourself by using the QQ-CLI. And if you run that command, QQ-FS-GetACL, give it a path and give it the optional flag --JSON, you get to see what the raw format of that looks like. And I'll give you a quick example of that. So right here on the right side on the green, I can run a QQ-FS-GetACL. ACL. Give it a path, give it a path to my root. Normally, if you run this by itself, you get just, I guess I was logged in. So let me log in first. QQ login, admin. Run that command again. Normally, you see just a nice human readable version of that output. But if you give it the optional --JSON flag, you get to see what the raw kind of format that we store in the metadata of your files. This is what it looks like. So the same format, regardless of the protocol that wrote the files. So this is kind of a key concept in Qumulo. So RBAC and file access have a kind of special relationship that must be kept in mind. There is a particular privilege in RBAC called file full access. And any user that has this privilege, that user can get to any object by completely bypassing the verification of that QACL. So the built-in administrators and data administrators roles, they both have this privilege. So in our UI here, if I go to role management and I take a look at the rights that admin has, you would see this file full access is checked. So that particular user, I would skip checking the permissions altogether. But that being said, any user that has that privilege is still subject to the SMB share permissions, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And they are still subject to any NFS export restrictions. So just because you have this privilege doesn't mean you get to bypass these two particular parts here. And this is something that comes up in our support calls fairly frequently. So let's go over some common best practices. And incidentally, if you have any questions throughout my presentation here, feel free to type it in the Q&A section or in the chat, and Mandy and Billy will kind of let me know that you guys have a question. So common question that we get, especially as new clusters are being set up, is, should I share my root directory? Now, normally access to the root directory should be restricted to admin only for maintenance use. It shouldn't be something that is your users would normally have access to. And that being said, I also consider best practice to create your shares and exports in a directory that is actually above the root and not on the root itself. The reason for this is to give you a bit more future flexibility if you need to move things around. So I'll give you an example of that. If I go into my client here, I have my webinar cluster. If I go to my root share, which is my file share, you see that I created a directory called share root. And in this directory, I have my two other directories that will then become shares or have been converted into SMB shares. This could be the same principle for NFS exports. Now, the reason I like it doing this way is because if I need to move this guy somewhere else, for example, I have more flexibility to then create maybe a different department or maybe even create a different company if I get into multi-tenancy or some other scenarios like that. So I think creating your shares just one step above the root will give you some future flexibility that you might not have if the shares are starting right at the root. So one thing to also keep in mind is that if I were to move a share or export directory, then I have to manually update this in my UI. So if I were to take this accounting directory and move it back to files, I would have to go into my share settings here and then update that directory. So users that are currently connected, they'll stay connected, but future connections will fail because we can't find that directory. So this does not get updated dynamically because you moved it behind the scenes. So another common question is, should I create my share directory in advance, or should I go through the web UI? If you take a look at the web UI here, and I want to create a new share, I have an option to create a directory if it doesn't exist. So why would I want to do it one way or the other? So if I create a directory in advance, I have the opportunity to apply exactly the permissions that I want in advance compared to creating it via the web UI. If I use the web UI, then the owner of that directory will be whomever is currently logged in. So if I have a Qumulo admin account logged in or some other account that is allowed to create directories, that will be set as the owner of that directory. But if I do it in advance, I can kind of set the owner to be whomever. Now, any directory that's created via the web UI will have a default set of permissions, which is normally a 755 mode with the owner, whoever is logged in, and then the primary group of that owner, or it will inherit any inheritable ACLs from the parent directory. So it's usually, by and large, a better idea to pre-create the directory, then convert it into a share, in my opinion. So another common topic is the fact that SMB, the protocol SMB, has a number of different characters that are considered illegal. So these characters here, from quotes to the slashes, the colon, and so on, these are considered illegal by SMB protocol, including some control codes. So there are certain combinations of letters and words that cannot be used in the naming of files inside of SMB. And we see commonly that when you have an SMB and NFS and SMB mixed protocol environment, that you very often can actually create illegal characters accidentally. But the way that Qumulo handles that stuff is that when we detect these characters, we will map them to a particular Unicode, which is kind of like a Unicode for an empty value. It looks different in every different platform. Usually on Windows, you see a solid dot. But then we preserve the character in the metadata, but we make sure the SMB clients don't freak out and they can actually display that. So you can actually review what the actual name is over NFS or via the QQ-CLI. So if you run this command get file get adder, you would see the actual legal characters. So as an example here, I'm going to go into my NFS client and I will create something that is actually named that doesn't work. So this is something that we see in media and entertainment environments fairly frequently. For example, someone can name a directory after a timestamp. This is perfectly legal over NFS, but Windows doesn't like that. So you see the colons are converted into dots there. That's something to keep in mind. If you need to rename that stuff, you want to do that through the NFS client, or you can actually do it through here too. But so case sensitivity is another one. Qumulo is a case sensitive and case preserving file system, but the SMB protocol is case preserving but not case sensitive. So NFS is definitely a case sensitive and preserving file system. So you can create something that's upper and lower case and have conflicting names. But over SMB, the protocol often can't differentiate between the two. So if I create something that is upper like that, sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes the Windows client might not be able to accurately differentiate between the two. So especially the older Windows, modern Windows tends to handle this a little bit better, but older Windows clients kind of freak out. And when you double click on the stuff, you don't really know which one you're going to land on. So if you need to delete one of those things, you probably want to do it through the NFS client or through the QQ CLI, just so you can ensure that you're interacting with the correct object. So shares and symlinks, another common topic. So Qumulo provides NFS and SMB cross-protocol symlink or hardlink compatibility, meaning that you can create symlinks on NFS and follow them over SMB. You create hardlinks over SMB and follow them over NFS. But there's some limitations. So you can create an export that points to a symlink, but you should not create an SMB share that points to a symlink, even though technically you can do it. And possibly this is something that we should prevent in our code. But right now you can create it on a symlink, but you never be able to mount it. Now, when it comes to following links on a remote file system in Windows specifically, this is something you have to enable on your Windows client. So there is a tool here, and we make this available later. But if you want to follow links on SMB on Windows, you have to turn it on the client. It's not something that is set on Qumulo, but on your Windows client. And then another really important topic is very common best practice is that you don't want to accidentally create a backdoor of access. You have to really take a look at how you're creating your shares and exports and making sure that your users cannot circumvent some restrictions that you applied because you provided another way into the file system. And an example of this would be if I create, in this case, you might notice that I have 3 shares. One of them is pointing to the root. So if I create a bunch of restrictions on these 2 shares at the top, but then I'll leave this guy wide open, any user can mount this and get directly to these other 2 directories because this is the parent directory. Same thing with NFS. You want to make sure that I don't accidentally just leave a wide open NFS export that any user with NFS access can get to. So I had to keep an eye on this stuff. Another thing to keep in mind is that every single protocol provided by Qumulo, and that includes our REST API, has the potential to access the entire namespace. So every protocol has the potential, not necessarily the automatically right to access everything in the Qumulo. So it's a good practice to lock down any unused protocols, anything you're not using. Make sure you don't turn FTP on if you don't need it on, or if you're turning on S3, that you have the right kind of permissions set on the files. And you want to also keep an eye on any old access tokens that you no longer need and any local user accounts that you might not be using anymore. And then you want to make use of root squashing for NFS users, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. So another common topic is move versus copy. So very often you need to move very large directories to other locations in a Qumulo cluster. And it's a pretty simple operation. if you use just the move utility here. So if I go into this guy back again, I go into this files directory, and if I need to move this large directory to the other share, it's pretty simple for me just to go into the other share and just drag that over. This will be a move, and this is like an instant relinking behind the scenes. Doesn't matter how big that large directory is, the move is immediate. But I have to pay attention that I'm not crossing share boundaries. So if I go back over here and I go directly into that share and I drag this directory, I'm actually copying it and I'm making a duplicate of it. So if you need to move something, you want to either do this through the same sort of root access share, for the root directory, your admin access share, or you can do an FS rename operation through the QQ CLI. You can do this behind the scenes. So move and rename is basically the same thing. You just point to the destination, give it a source and the new name, which can actually match the original name, and you're relinking everything. So it's an instant move. So let's go into SMB shares as a topic specifically. Hopefully I am not talking too fast. There's quite a bit of material here, so I apologize in advance. If you need me to slow down a little bit, just drop a note in the chat and I'll try to pull the pace back a little bit. So access space enumeration, there's some confusion around this. So this is actually a share option, which controls the visibility of items inside of a share. So a user would have to have read privilege to objects inside of a share to see them enumerated. So an example of this, I have my two Windows clients. I'm logged in as user Batman on this side, I'm logged in as user Spider-Man on this side. If we both go into the access based enumeration share, you'd see that I see some stuff that is different from the other user. Batman is the only user that has read privileges on this directory. Spider-Man is the only guy that can read this directory. They're both in the same place in the file system, but what gets presented is dependent on the users having to have read rights. So this functionality could be expensive on the server side, on the Qumulo side, if the directory has many thousands of entries, and these entries are very complex. There's very complex permissions because the cluster has to calculate what it should present given for any user. So if you're dealing with directories with hundreds of thousands of objects, you probably don't want to have this functionality turned on. And you do that right at the share options there. Actually, SMB shares. You turn this option on and off right there. Now, this option does not control the visibility of the share itself. That is done in a different place. We'll talk about that in a second. So SMB encryption is an option, again, on a share level, where you can enforce the use of SMB v3 traffic encryption. So every single SMB message, all the control messages, all the data messages, they will be encrypted. This has a potential to incur a penalty in performance due to the fact that both ends now have to perform a bunch of extra work to encrypt that traffic. And turning this on will effectively lock out any clients who cannot speak SMB v3. So Windows 7, Windows Vista would be excluded from connecting. As an example, maybe even older Linux clients that cannot speak SMB v3, old Mac clients. Now, this can be turned on cluster-wide if mandated by your company's policy. So looking at this guy here, if I check this box on, that would turn on encryption just for this share. If I go into SMB settings, I can turn it on cluster-wide. So let's talk a little bit about share versus NTFS permissions. So NTFS permissions are the permissions on the files and directories themselves. Share permissions are the permissions at the entryway of the Qumulo file system. Now, both are used to calculate the actual final level of access, and the most restrictive of the two wins. So a way to look at share permissions is that they determine what your maximum rights will be once they enter the share. Then once you get past these maximum rights, your level of access will be evaluated by whatever the file permissions say. Now, every single user in the system, including the built-in admin, is bound by these rules. So it doesn't matter that you're a Qumulo administrator, you still have to respect these rules. So if I take a look at my SMB share here, I have my share permissions here. If, for example, I have deny local admin, it doesn't matter that I'm admin, I am still not allowed to go in. Same thing is that if I didn't have this everyone group and I didn't have the read privileges, then I couldn't connect to it. Same thing with write. So you use the two in conjunction. They're really not meant to replace each other. And it's also important to understand that these share permissions that we see here, these permissions are not inherited and they do not show up on the files. So they're actually just the rights at the door, like the bouncer at the door. They're a nice and quick way to exclude one particular user. So I can say the main users is allowed to connect, but user Joe, who is a member of the main users, is not allowed to write. So I can selectively exclude certain users, and I can do this without having to propagate permissions all the way down the chain here. And again, they're not meant as a replacements for one another, but they should be used in tandem. So the default permissions management is another option of SMB. And this is an option that determines what the default POSIX permissions that will be applied to both files and directories created in the share. Now, there's a very, very important kind of gotcha here. This option would only take effect if there are no inheritable NTFS permissions in that directory. So if I take a look at my options here at the bottom, advanced options, I have this file create mode and default directory create mode. If the directory in question inside of this share, not just the accounting top level directory here, but anything inside of this share, if a directory does not have a set of inheritable permissions, then create files with this mode. So this is very useful if you follow a POSIX first permissions management scenarios and you want to ensure that your SMB clients do the right thing. So this basically emulates a UMask value for your SMB clients. So, but it does not really force a mode, which is kind of a source of confusion sometimes. So this is not forcing a mode. It's only applying it if there are no inheritable permissions. Now, bypass reverse writes is another option that causes some confusion. So if this option is enabled, and it is enabled in the system, a user will have direct access to any object for which that user has read access by the user providing the direct path to it. So what does that mean? So if I'm sitting here inside of this directory and I make a new doc here, and I want to share this with user Spider-Man, you got to remember that Spider-Man can't get to this folder. It's not allowed to, but I can actually add Spider-Man to the permissions of this object, and I can send Spider-Man that link directly to it, and that user can just type in that link and get directly to that object if this option is turned on. It's usually turned off by default on a Mac. The reason for this is that if you're replacing some Windows servers with Qumulo, this is how Windows Server works out of the box. So if you have mysterious sort of failures in access because you replace a Windows server with a Qumulo cluster, you probably have to turn that option on. So the user that can get to the object won't necessarily have access to everything else in that directory, though. They only have access to objects that a user has read writes to and knows the path to that. That is turned on at this level here. You go into the SMB sharing settings and you turn that option on right there if you need it. But normally you probably want to have that turned off unless you really, really need it. Now, controlling share visibility is, again, something that some users get confused because They would think that access-based enumeration that we talked about would turn this feature on and off. But in this case, controlling the visibility of a share is determined via a flag that you set over the QQ CLI. So you can turn on the option to hide shares from unauthorized hosts, meaning that visibility of a SMB share is determined by network privileges. Are you coming from the right IP? Are you coming from the right network? Or you can hide shares from unauthorized users, which means that only the users that are present on the share permissions that we talked about, only the users that show up on this list are allowed to see that share. So if I turn this on and I go back into my Windows client and I do a whack server name, the stuff that shows up here is going to be determined by whether or not I have rights to these things here. So it's a very quick and effective way to hide a share that doesn't involve doing the old $sign at the name after the name of the share. Like in this case, I'll do $sign here to hide a share. You don't need to do that. You just turn that option on the QQ CLI. Now, the network access management is kind of an extra layer of access control that works in conjunction with file permissions and share permissions. So this is an additional option for each individual share that is managed via the QQ CLI. You can apply individual IPs or subnets that are allowed to access, and you have these particular options here. You can determine who can have full control, who can only read if you're coming from the wrong network. Do I deny specific hosts or do I deny everybody? Now, where this becomes useful is that, for example, let's say that you have a share, an SMB share that has some sensitive information, and you want to ensure that anyone that accesses that share has to be coming from the correct network. So I want everyone to be in the office to get to that share. I don't want anyone coming in over VPN and having access to that share. So I would say deny hosts my VPN's subnet, and then full control hosts my local office subnet. So you do this right through the SMB mod share, and you turn the stuff on and off. So it's a kind of an extra layer. Now, these things, again, they don't give you extra rights just because I turned this on. They all work together in conjunction. So all the other stuff we talked about still has to be in play. So another option for SMB is that you can manage the visibility of the special .snapshot directory. So that directory, as you know, is completely immutable by any user via any file protocol. So it doesn't matter what user you're using, you can't go into the .snapshot directory and delete anything, modify anything. But tools running in Windows, particularly like your mass changing permissions, or if you're running robocopy, or if you're doing something on the command line, in Windows in particular, it seems to happen more often. They stumble across that snapshot directory and you have some errors, like your tool will stop working because you try to do something with that directory and becomes kind of a hassle, especially if you have a long running job and you're leaving for the weekend and you come back on Monday and you realize that the thing stopped because you hit a .snapshot directory. So you can control the visibility of this directory via the CLI. You can change how we handle this special directory, how we present it to SMB clients. And you have the option to make it visible, which is the default. You can make it hidden, meaning that it would not show up in directory listings. And you can actually disable it, meaning that even if I knew it was there, I wouldn't be able to just type .snapshot like I can now. I can just type .snapshot and files. Got a delay on my Windows client here. Cancel that. This guy's pokey for some reason. Files.snapshot. I can go inside of it, see that hidden snapshot, even though it didn't show up. If I set it to disable, then this behavior is turned off, but your Windows previous versions, right click, that still works. So that's the same for any other SMB client, incidentally, not just Windows. So it's a handy thing. I usually set it to hidden so Windows doesn't keep running across it. So that is it for SMB. Any quick Q&A stuff, guys, on the that I can field real quick.
Yeah, one here from Russ that would be good if you can just clarify on. When you move a directory, in terms of replication that's on the directory, that would actually constitute as a remove and copy in terms of replication because of snapshotting and replication policies, right?
Correct. Yeah. So if you move a directory that is in a directory that is being replicated to another Qumulo cluster, then that directory doesn't automatically show up on the other end. That becomes a whole new data move because it's going to be part of a different snapshot family.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, thank you. Just want to confirm it.
For sure.
There's a couple other open questions that I'm fielding.
Okay, we'll cover them later.
One from Mark Graves is more for the end, so we can leave that. And
okay,
get to John. Go ahead.
Good deal. All right. So let's talk a little bit about NFS exports. So probably the number one question when it comes to NFS lately is, should I use V3 or should I use V4.1? So there's some advantages of V3. It's got a performance edge over 4.1. That gap has been closing lately. V3 is still a simpler protocol, so it's going to be faster pretty much in perpetuity, I think, just because it's a simpler protocol. It's much easier to implement. It's a lot easier to get SMB V3 to working than it is 4.1. And very importantly, it's a familiar experience in POSIX only permissions management environments. What this means is that, if you got a bunch of users that have been changing the mode of the directories and doing chmods and ls to look at permissions, V3 is home, while 4.1 is going to be a different experience. So there's some significant disadvantage to V3, though. You have non-stateful connections, meaning that the state between the server and the client is never really maintained. So very often the NFS client won't know that the server is no longer there. And if you ever had a Linux NFS mount hang, then you know what I'm talking about. You also don't have user authentication. You just send us a UID number and we believe you. You don't have support for modern ACLs, the V4.1 ACLs or NTFS ACLs. And you can't really view what the real permissions are over V3 because you just can't. There's no support for actually seeing these type of 4.1 ACLs. And you don't have real true file locking. So if you have an environment that has a lot of concurrent access to files, 4.1 might provide you better data consistency. So what are the advantages of 4.1? Obviously, stateful connections, the server and the client, they always know they are connected to each other. You have support for true ACLs, and they're directly based on NTFS ACLs, and you can actually manage these ACLs directly with specific tools for you to view and edit these permissions lists. You have true file locking, where you have a stateful lock that is held and understood by all of the clients. You have now the ability to provide positive user authentication via the Kerberos protocol. And when you're using Kerberos, you can turn on traffic signing for some extra security, and you can turn on traffic encryption for even more security. So this would give you some parity to the SMB V3 security options. So again, your company's security policy might require that you turn this stuff on. Now, what are the disadvantages of 4.1? Probably the primary one is that it's quite a bit more complex to get Kerberos to work than it is just to fire up a V3 export. There's quite a bit more client side set up, not just on the Qumulo side, but on your client side. And these permission management tools, they're not as familiar as just change the mode with chmod. Yeah, they're might be foreign to some of your users that have been doing things the old way for many years. And there is a performance penalty for Kerberos encryption. You know, you're adding quite a bit more overhead to both the server and the client to add this additional layer of security. Now, Kerberos by itself, without packet signing and encryption, it's got really no performance penalty. It's sign-ons are pretty quick, so there's no real reason not to turn Kerberos on for authentication, but the extra security does add some overhead. So what are the requirements for enable 4.1 on your cluster today? Well, probably the big one is that your root directory, the /share, it has to be renamed just because of the way the 4.1 mounts. The way these mounts work, you can't have the root directory be called root. So usually we end up just calling it root/root. And if you're going to mount it over v3, then you're basically pointing it towards /root. Modern clusters actually misnomer here, but recent clusters are clusters that were installed recently with the recent versions of our Qumulo core software. They would have 4.1 enabled by default, but in older installs, if you guys have been customers for a bit, you have to turn v4 on with QQ NFS modify settings and turn it on. Kind of a gotcha here is that if you have Linux clients and you're just using a simple mount command and not specifying what protocol version you're using, Linux will start at 4.2, go down to 4.1, then 4.0, then v3 and v2 and so on. So it starts at 4.2, fails, and then starts at 4.1, succeeds, and then stops there. So if you don't specify the version on the mount, then your Linux clients would then mount at 4.1. So if you want to ensure that they're mounting v3, you have to statefully say vers equal v3 on your mount options. Now, we have quite extensive documentation available for you to enable Kerberos support with 4.1. Our devs did a fantastic job writing this guide that goes through entire scenarios, troubleshooting scenarios, everything. And we can help you get Kerberos to work too if you're interested in using the feature. Now, let's talk a little bit about host access restrictions. They are export restrictions which control which hosts or subnets are allowed to access and export. Now, these rules are enforced on a first match basis. As soon as we make a match, we stop checking. So you should have individual IP specific rules at the top, and then subnet wide rules at the bottom. I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about here. So if I go back to my NFS Exports panel, and I take a look at this thing here, I can add which IP is allowed to connect. So if I do this number here and I hit save, then only this IP is allowed to connect. So if I do this and I hit save, I have to add more rules to cover all the other scenarios. You can have a number of different ways of putting these addresses in there. You can do single IPs, you can do dash separated, you can use CIDR or netmask formats. They apply to both NFS v3 and 4.1 clients. And then every single user, doesn't matter who the user is, you are bound by these restrictions. Another functionality of the host restrictions is that you can do either user mapping or root squashing. Now, user mapping lets you control the incoming UID and GID identities. These are the POSIX identities that are provided over NFS of any NFS request coming in. And the reason we want to do this, specifically, a couple of scenarios here. So I'm going to talk about controlling the behavior root first. So any user that can become a local suitor, and I'll show you in this guy here. So I can become root with this guy. Now I ID myself, I am UID 0. UID 0 inside of Qumulo is considered to be Qumulo admin. So if I go into my local users and groups, you notice that user admin is UID 0. So any user that is allowed to become root locally could potentially have the same level of access as Qumulo admin. And again, going back to the start of this presentation, if you remember, we have that role that gives Qumulo admin access to all files. So we don't even look at the permissions. So you want to control that behavior. And we do this by adding some restrictions that say that if you're coming from this IP, and let's say that this is my management IP for my admin's machine here, I can say that this guy has no mapping, but everybody else map root to some other value. Now, there's kind of a little hidden thing here that some people might not realize is sitting there. I can either point it to some user. I can type the user name here. I can say guest, and then the local guest pops in. Or I can actually type UID colon. As soon as I do that, I get a second box that lets me type which UID number and GID number should root be converted to. So this means that if you come in with UID 0 from anything that's not this IP, then you're going to be remapped to this other UID, and you're only going to have the rights that this other UID and GID have. Now, the handy thing about the map all option, which is in here, I can say map everybody to some other value, is that let's say that I have a server farm that has a bunch of Linux machines that I don't have any control over their internal identities. I can actually make every one of those hosts run as the same user. This way, I don't have to worry about controlling the internal identity of those NFS clients. I'm just going to remap them all to be something else. Or, if I have a set of freelancers that come in and they come in with their own Mac laptops and they want to connect over NFS, and I don't have any control over their identities, but I can force them all to run as the same user. So it's a pretty handy thing for those scenarios. And again, we can map them to any discretionary UID GID number by adding that little value right there. And so I don't confuse myself, I'm going to delete these rules. Hit save. Cool. So we also have some options for older NFS clients. If you have a client that's like old AIX client or a very old version of Linux or Unix, a lot of those clients might not be able to support 64-bit fields. So you can actually mod a individual export and control which fields are presented as 32-bit, particularly like file IDs and file system size. You have a 4 GB limit on 32-bit limit. This will kind of mangle the real values and sort of present effectively a faked value if it's too big to be shown as a 32-bit value. So if you have some older NFS clients, I mean, this is the way to get them to connect and not freak out. So any questions on the NFS stuff, Phil?
I don't think we
Or
have
Mandy, or Bill?
I don't think we have any that I haven't responded to. There was one question that came up in terms of for SMB
Sure.
about the option of offering offline files the same way Windows Files servers do.
Yeah. This is not something that we currently do. That would be a feature request. I think we can, if you just take the name of the guest that asked that question, we can
Anonymous attendee.
have our. Oh, I see. We can have yeah, it's not a thing that we currently do. So we don't do offline files. It is something that we want to do, but it's not a thing that our protocol stack supports right now.
From Russ that just came in, how does root squash differ from mapping root to someone else?
Sorry, can you say the question again?
How does root squash differ from mapping root to someone else or something else?
Well, root squash is anytime you control the behavior of root, anytime you take UID 0 and you make it be something else, that's root squashing effectively. So except that the map all takes every single incoming UID number in consideration, while map root to only looks at UID 0. So if I'm coming in as myself with my own sort of, if I go back over here to my example here, if I'm coming in under my own UID 2001 and I have map route to something else, guest, then I don't change this value because I don't care about this value. I only care about UID 0. So that's really the difference. But map all to maps everybody. Map route to just changes only the root user. Hopefully that answers the question. So let's talk a little bit about troubleshooting some common access issues. One that is kind of tricky, but we see happen all the time is, what account am I really using? Specifically, like in Windows. So if I go into my Windows client, and if I have admin access, I can launch PowerShell. So let me launch this as admin here. Run as admin. Let me authenticate. So I know I'm logged in as user Batman. I know this. But sometimes when you're doing, when you're mounting shares as different users, Windows will kind of tend to cache those logins. And when you think you're actually connected as a specific user, you might be connected as a different user. So there's a way for you to actually see exactly which user you're using. If you become an admin, launch PowerShell, you can run git-smb connection. And this will show you exactly which user you are using. So one thing that I can see happen here, I'm going to close this and I am going to make sure that I don't have anything connected. I'm actually going to actively net use the everything. And I'm going to run this again. And I have nothing connected. What I'm going to do is that I'm going to map a network drive, the same server, webinar files, but I'm going to use a different user. Connect to Spider-Man. Now I am connected as user Spider-Man. The local logged in user is Batman. The credential used is Spider-Man. And here's the weird thing that Windows does. If I close this, if I go in here and I give it -- webinar again, sometimes Windows will use the last credential that I used for that server. And let's see if it did it here. See that? The file share, the non-map letter drive one, use the last login that I used. So this will cause confusion very frequently because you think you're using the local account, but Windows decided to use the last value that it used to connect to that share. So this is something that you see happen all the time. So keep that command in mind so you can actually get to verify exactly what account you're using. And another thing to look into, very important, is what door did I use to come into the file system. So if I go back over here and I close this stuff and I'm going to delete all the entries, I won't do that. And I'm going to make sure I don't have anything mounted. I got to wait for that guy to die out. What I'm talking about here is that if I go into a share, and I turned on access-based enumeration, I should not be seeing bad stuff. I know I turned it on. I came over here to my SMB shares and I went to that share and I turned it on. Why is this user seeing that folder? I should not be able to see Peter Parker's folder. Well, you got to ask yourself, how did I get into the file system? Well, you notice I didn't get in through that ABE share up there. I came in through a parent share that has more permissive rights. So this is something that has to be taken into account. So you always have to keep in mind, how did I get into that file system? And that helps explain why perhaps you have different levels of access than you think you should have had. You know, the evaluation of these share rights here, they only happen at the share entry. If I come in through a different level, then I'm being evaluated by a different set of rules. And then another common sort of thing is group membership issues. I have a user that I know, I went into Active Directory and I added this user to this group. Why am I not able to connect to that directory? I added a certain user to a directory. I added that user to that group. That user should be able to get into that directory, but I'm getting an access denied. Well, it's important to remember that any Kerberos session, anything like Windows logins, you get your group membership from your login, and you don't get that membership list updated until you renew your Kerberos token. So if I add this user right now to a group, that user won't know it's a member. This session won't know it's a member of that group. So when you do an NTLM connection, meaning that you use a username and a password, like anytime you provide a username and password, that's NTLM. If you do a single sign-on, then it's Kerberos. NTLM evaluates the rights with every new connection. Kerberos will keep that until the ticket expires. So if you want to refresh the group memberships of your users, you can do a K-list purge. I think I got the right syntax here. It would purge your tickets. You have to do it for your account. In this case, I'm doing for the administrator. But if I do a K-list purge here, that's going to ask for a new ticket. So if I do a K-list, that will show me, actually, I don't even have a ticket now, but here, let me log into this guy. And I should get a new ticket here. Nope, I guess I don't have it. But this will evaluate a new ticket. It was going to go out, ask Active Directory for a new ticket, and then I get my new group membership. So you can kind of do this as a troubleshooting step and see if your user now has access that you expect that user to have. But just keep in mind, just because you added somebody to a group, it doesn't mean they immediately know that they're a member of that group. We talked a little about that internal QACL format, so I can kind of pass this. And again, that file full access. Am I able to get to that file that I think I have locked down? I put some really restrictive permissions on this particular directory here, and I don't want any other user, including myself, to get to it. How come I can still see that stuff? Well, is your user a member of one of these groups that have elevator rights, or did you create an account that has the elevator right? You got to remember, if you have that role privilege, file full access, then it doesn't matter what the permissions on the files themselves say. So we often see that causing confusion because we'll get, how come this user can get to it? Well, that user is an administrator internally. And another kind of cool sort of thing that we can do with our back, and I hate this function of how Google Slides does this. Another thing that we can do with these RBACs is that we can create, for example, a backup operator. So what a backup operator will be a user that can read every file. So I can use a combination of file permissions, RBAC and share permissions to create that kind of role. So if I go into my cluster here, I'm going to create a new role, and I'll call this backup operator, backup user. I'll give that user the single right of full access. I'm going to save that user, and I can then add some kind of member to it. I'm going to say that NFS users as a group. So this group would be backup operators. But here's the thing. I can go into my SMB shares, and let's say I wanted to back up my root share. I am going to add a deny entry that says 80 NFS users are denied right or change permissions. Those users can connect and they can read. And I'm going to need to add a second allow rule here. So I'm going to add an allow rule that says NFS NFS users is allowed to read. So even though that account can get to every file and read everything, that account will still not be able to be subverted for like ransomware and be used to encrypt files or delete stuff I don't want it to delete. So now any member of that group can go into the file share, read everything, but not modify anything. So you effectively create a backup operator role that's pretty secure. And then another thing that I'm just going to barely touch on because cross-protocol permissions is a very large topic. But one of the things is that if you're doing cross-protocol permissions, particularly if you're doing NFS and NFS v3 and SMB concurrent access, that if you are using Active Directory to manage the POSIX permissions, you're using Active Directory for POSIX attributes, that this base DN here, this determines the scope where Qumulo goes to take a look at the attributes and pull the attributes of your NFS users and your SMB users. So you have to make sure that the directory that we're pointing Qumulo to inside of your AD domain contains the user that we're interested in. If you don't specify anything here when you join AD with Qumulo, then we default to the CN equal users directory, which might not be where your user accounts are. So you have to make sure that you point to the right place. So this comes up all the time. If you know that you have POSIX attributes saved inside of your file system, inside of Active Directory, and this particular NFS UID should be evaluated properly, just take a look at that base DN. You can now edit this without having to leave the domain, which is pretty handy. I mean, I can turn using AD on and off, and I can edit the base DN. If I have a trusted domain, I can actually specify the trusted domain in here. So Simpsons local is another domain that I have a trust with this particular domain here. So I can cross domain barriers. I have to do a semicolon, not a comma. I can cross domain barriers through the trust and pull POSIX attributes from users in a trusted domain, which is pretty handy in some cases. Let's go take a look at the questions, Phil. This is the last slide that we have in our regular program. So let's take a look at the Q&A.
Yeah, so sorry, I've been going through replies to answers. We've got a few open. So first one was from Mark Graves. He'd like to touch on the topic again about
totally. Yeah, I'm reading it. Sorry. Yeah. So the question is creating additional shares on the root directory. So I talked about why perhaps you should not just create the shares right at the root. So I have my file share. I could just create a directory here, convert it into a share. Right? Nothing really prevents me from doing this. I think the reason to create the share root is that if I had some set of inheritable permissions here that I want to propagate down, but then I need to have a second set of permissions to be applied to a different department, for example. That's a scenario that I've seen before. I want to take my share root where all my shares starts. And at the very root here, I want to say, these are the permissions that get applied to all these shares. But that might not be what fits this other share that I want to create, this new share. So I am going to create it, some other directory for it, or maybe bring it back to the root and then have some different set of permissions here. So, and when we're now getting to access based on, sorry, I take that back. When we are getting into multi-tenancy, which I'll have another webinar in the future on this topic, where you can actually have very distinct access to the SMB shares and NFS exports based on your network of origin that is quite a bit more advanced than what we had before. You definitely want to have different directories to create your shares into, because you want to isolate these more statefully. Hopefully that answers the question. I might not be doing a good job explaining why you should do it this way, but I think it just gives you much more flexibility to move things around later, especially if you want to change permissions on directories, where sometimes you kind of get stuck. If everything is starting right at the root, you don't have any place to go down from there. So I like to start things up one. You can even create a new, if you want complete separation, you can just say, this is my NFS root, and have a whole different world of permissions management here. If you don't want to do cross protocol, then create my exports at this level. Hopefully that answers your question, Mark. So Jeffrey has a question. If a directory is shared via both SMB and NFS and a file is created in SMB, what is the default permissions? And are there any gotchas? So the default permissions for something that is written over SMB, it depends on what the directory looks like. So if I take a look at this brand new NFS root directory I created, you would notice that I have non-inheritable POSIX permission. So what I'm looking at here is basically the equivalent of 755 with Peter Parker as the owner, domain users as the group owner, and then others as everyone. Now, in this directory, if I come in over SMB and I create something, the permissions that will be applied will be on files. It will be the equivalent of this mode right here that I set. That's what gets created. As soon as I add an inheritable permission, I'm going to go in here and I'm going to say, I'm going to call this ACL. And I am going to add a property here, security. I'm going to say that the main users gets full control. I'm going to apply that. Now, if I take a look at advanced, you see that this is inheritable, applies to subfolders and files. So if I go with my other user here, webinar, I go into my file share. I go into NFS root. I create something here. There is no inheritance. Actually, I'm not even allowed to write because of that 755 mode. So, but if I go in here, when I create something, the rights would be the only entry in that ACL is going to be the single inheritable permission, which is the main users right there. So I stop looking at this because there is an inheritable entry in the permissions list. So that just stops. That this stops having a value or functionality as soon as an inheritable entry is present on the list. Then this guy takes over. So hopefully that answers your question, Jeff. Is it required to use POSIX when doing cross protocol? Not at all. No. We give you the freedom to pick whatever mode makes the most sense for your situation. So Qumulo lets you pick whatever permissions method you want to use at any given place in the file system. I don't have to set a mode in my Qumulo cluster. I can choose that at this level. I'll give a good example of this. I am going to create a new folder here, and I should probably stop using this client because it's slow, but this is POSIX. Okay, and I'm going to create a new one that is going to be NTFS. In the NTFS folder, I have an inheritable set of permissions, and I wonder if I'm going to be able to do this. Let me see. I'm going to go into the POSIX folder, and I might get access denied. We'll find out. I'm going to remove inheritance, remove all of them, and then I'm going to add some non-inheritable permissions here. I'm going to set like a POSIX mode. I'm going to say that Batman has read, write, and execute. Okay. And I'm going to add the main users. So I'm trying to kind of simulate 770 mode. So I'm going to set this here has read, write, and execute, and then I'm going to keep everyone off. And actually, I need to change this scope to this folder only. Okay, and then this guy. So these are not inheritable. And consequently, too, now that this is not inheritable, I'm going to apply it to the directory. So now I have them both. I have a directory that when I come in with this guy here, and I write something in here, I'm actually going to change this so you see more graphically here. I'm going to change this to 600 and this to 770 on that share. If I go in here and I create a new file, the only entry in there, I'm the only guy that can read. So everybody else, these guys here have read attributes. This way I can still work on the back end. But if I go into my client here, I'm going to CD back to webinar. And take a look. Oops. CD into NFS root, ACL. And if I go into POSIX, you see I have the 700 multiplied. Actually, 7. Well, I got the read, so I can read the permissions on the thing. But that lets you, we can basically pick exactly what permissions they have. The same thing with this other directory. This directory is NTFS. And if I write something with Spider-Man on that, I basically inherit the permissions of this directory. So you get to choose. It's not necessary that you use POSIX. You get to pick whatever makes the most sense for you. Hopefully that answers your question. It's a much broader topic, cross protocol, and I can have a whole other separate webinar just on this, but hopefully that kind of helps a little bit. So Kent has a question. Are any plans to break out the base DN into users and groups? So we can do different base DNs based on the type. So let me see the use cases so that we don't end up enumerating all exchange groups and whatnot. Well, that hasn't really come up, to be honest, Kent. Does the ability to allow you to specify multiple base DNs, does that help you if I say like OU equal group 1 like this, and then I add another entry that OU equal group 2. So you're being very stateful about where to look as opposed to enumerating everything. I wonder if this helps your use case. Because you can put multiple entries, and we're going to look through all of the entries, but this might be more focused than actually searching the entire top level domain, which is what I specify here. In my particular example, I have a pretty small test AD domain, really not a big deal for me to list everything, but you might not want to do this in a very large domain. Okay, we'll take a look in the channel and cover that, no problem. Is it possible to prevent SMB clients from creating ACLs in a POSIX first environment? Absolutely. And the way to do this, ironically, is to borrow a tool from the NTFS side, which is a special little guy called owner rights. So owner rights is what is known as a well-known SID. It's a kind of special placeholder SID. This guy controls the rights of a user. So this will control the rights, the behavior of both the POSIX users in this directory. So this will prevent a file owner over NFS from changing the mode of their own files, which is pretty nice, and also prevents a user from creating ACLs. But there's actually a quicker way to do this too. You can go into the share permissions, and you can just disable the change permissions right for that particular group or user. If the user is not allowed to change permissions at the share permission, then it doesn't matter what the file permissions say. You can have full control, you still wouldn't be able to change permissions because, again, you got to remember most restrictive wins. So the one that is most restrictive ends up being the truth here. So if you do this right now on your machines, then your SMB clients cannot create access. They'll be bound by the POSIX permissions. They can't modify stuff. There's some stuff on the chat. Get SMB. Any other questions on any of the stuff that we talked about? Cool. We'll make the recording of this available. I apologize in advance if I had to talk a little bit fast. I might have gotten a bit too optimistic about how much material I can fit in the hour here. Yes, good question, John. So John is asking, can you outline modifying share permissions with the Windows SMB console? So we can do this a couple of different ways. The first gotcha here is that to effectively modify these rights from Windows, you have to be using an administrator user, meaning that whatever user is going to be performing these operations would have to be either the built-in Qumulo administrator or would have to be someone that is in the data administrators group. So in this case, I'm going to just add user Batman to the administrator for this demo. And I'm going to go back to that Windows session. I want to make sure that I don't have anything connected. Let me clear this. I want to make sure I'm not connected. I'm still connected. I got to wait for this guy to go away here. This is actually my machine. It's connected to it. Oh, this is something else. This is my domain controller here. So I have a couple of different ways of doing this. I can launch I forgot the name of the thing, FS MGMT .msc. So this guy here, FS MGMT.msc, this is the file system management console. You can do a connect to. So here, right click right on this guy here and connect to another computer. And I'll go whack webinar. And I'm connected to webinar. And if I go into shares, this will show me all the different shares, and there's some extra stuff that you normally wouldn't see. Like our IPC share and our special Q dollar share. These are used by Windows to enumerate shares and do some other behind the scenes stuff. But I can actually now edit the stuff. I can edit the ABE rules. I can say properties. And I can control the share permissions through here. I can add and remove users. If I add somebody here, I'm going to say Spider-Man. Check names. And if my authentication worked correctly, I should be able to see this work. Okay, so that worked. Now if we go back in here to my UI and I look at my ABE share, you see that user Spider-Man was added to the list. So that I did it through Windows here. There's another way of doing this also. I can go into the share itself, webinar, and I can do, I'm connected to this guy here, properties. And if I go to security, advanced, I have those options right there too. For that particular share, I can edit that here, except I'm not doing it in the entire server. I'm only doing it on that share, but I can also do that through here. So can I control file and share permissions that is fully supported with Qumulo? I'm not quite understand your question, John. Can you elaborate a little bit more? One thing that we cannot do through the user interface on Qumulo yet is to be able to edit the file permissions. So these permissions here, you have to go through a client or you have to go through the QQ CLI. Oh, yes, totally, fully supported. Absolutely, yes. So doing it this way is fully supported. You can also do a couple of extra things here. You can see your open sessions, who's connected, and you can even close file handles. So if you have the right level of access, I can say, you know, so I got a user that has an Excel spreadsheet open and nobody else can save that spreadsheet. I can go in there, find that session, and I can close that particular open file and then unlock that and allow another user to connect to it. It can also kick somebody out from the system by closing their session, you know. So you got some extra tools in here, which is pretty nice. Yeah, I agree. This is a pretty handy way of doing this. Now, there are some limitations. I mean, I think we limit to 10,000 objects in here, but I think we might have actually exceeded that limit. If you have a busy cluster that has a lot of users connected, you might end up seeing a whole bunch of stuff in here. It might be difficult to see. You can also go into your cluster and we have commands that will let you show sessions. I think, what is it called? Sessions? Grep. So I like piping -H into grep to look for something because I cannot possibly remember all these QQ commands. But list sessions, so I can do that. QQ SMB list sessions, and I get a big old JSON blob of all the current connected sessions, and then I can do some work on that and find those sessions info. Infos. And I can further kind of chop this down and get exactly the type of information that I'm looking for. As a matter of fact, a quick way to see what kind of info is in a JSON blob, you can just put the stuff in quotes right there. Like that, single quotes, put a pipe, that's a JQ pipe inside of single quotes, and you get to see what the values are. So I have 3 different entries. Let me see what the first one has. Is guest, number opens, originator. So let's see what that looks like. There's the IP address. And if I take that 0 out, and I list all of them, so I get to see all the different IPs. I mean, I don't want this to descend into a how to do QQ and JQ kind of session, but you see there's some flexibility through the QQ CLI that maybe if you end up having way too much stuff to manage through this view here. And yes, you totally close the session from the UI. You just not through the Qumulo UI, but through this dialog here. So if you go through this dialog, you go through the QQ CLI, then you can just close the session through here. Yeah, from the Qumulo UI, no, unfortunately, we don't have a way to list that and do that through here. You do have a way to kick everybody out that might not be obvious at first. So let's say you have you need to put an emergency stop on the cluster. You can actually go into the QQ CLI, and I can say QQ SMB modify settings. And if you look at the help file in here, there is a dialect option right there. Supported dialects. You can actually turn off SMB if you say dialects blank. So if I do this number here, supported dialects, dialect empty. Wait, let me look at the help file. Dialect D, just empty quotes. I see, there's D by itself. Modified settings, D like this. So I effectively turned off SMB because there are no supported dialects. So if I go back to my Windows client here, I can't get inside at all. So this is like a really quick and easy way to just put the brakes on SMB completely across the entire Qumulo file system. I mean, let's say you have a runaway sort of ransomware attack or something like that. You can also do that with NFS. So if I take a look at QQ NFS, modify settings, I can actually disable auth.sys. So if I do this on, if let's say I have a bunch of V3 clients, NFS V3 clients, but I say disable auth.sys, this effectively disables the ability of any V3 client to connect. So if I go back to this guy here and I try to ls this directory, permission denied. So you got two easy ways to kind of kill the cluster here. So now I need to turn this back on. And I have to look at how to do that. All right, how do I turn this back on? Okay, I'm going to take this all, there he goes. All. So it's back on, and then enable auth.sys. Oh, this is SMB. Best. Enable auth.sys. Good. Now I'm working again. And if I go back to this client, it's working again. So quick and easy way to kind of put the stop on both of the protocols there. Cool. All right. Got a couple more minutes left here. Any other questions? All right. Again, thank you for joining us. Thank you for your engagement. We will make the video that's available. And as always, feel free to hit us up on Slack or send us an email directly and we can get you guys taken care of. So actually, real final question here from Miron, is SMB older than V3 turned off by default? No, it is not. The default behavior is for us to have all these protocols turned on all the time. So from 2.002 all the way up to 3.11. So from Vista all the way down to current systems. So you can disable them as necessary for your environment. The one thing we don't support or really never really intend to support is SMB v1. Quite a bit different protocol and quite insecure. So we're not going to be building support for that. All right, guys. Again, thank you for joining and look forward to seeing you guys on the next webinar. See you online.